This morning, we're publishing the Cambridge Approach to Textbooks. A printed copy is in your delegate pack, and as we speak, it is being published online on the Cambridge Assessment website. Those of you watching online can now find an electronic copy in the news feed at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Now, later in proceedings, Tim Oates, our Director of Assessment Research and Development, will guide you through it. 2 years ago, he gave a policy speech where he theorised what the challenges and requirements were. Today, 2 years on, we're delivering the practical outcome of that theorising. The approach is a set of guiding principles highlighting the information elements and design features upon which Cambridge Assessment and its partner publishers should focus when designing high-quality textbooks and resource materials. The principles presented here are the result of forensic dissection of the elements of high-quality materials, and they're a direct response to Tim's identification of the need to restore the primacy of real textbooks worldwide. The publication follows on from the Cambridge Assessment Approach to Assessment, published in 2009. We hold a series of events like this. They exist to provide a forum to debate key educational issues, because we believe assessment is part of the whole learning process. As an independent, not-for-profit voice working globally, we look at what works and try and balance the needs of the individual, the economy and society. Every year, 8 million learners take our exams in 170 countries. And with over 150 years' experience and the largest research facility of its kind, the Cambridge Assessment Group is chosen to be a key education partner to governments across the globe. We're committed to education excellence and are trusted by universities, colleges, employers and governments, and are proud of the relationships we build and the partnerships we form around the world. Our researchers publish and conduct and publish authoritative research in order to validate, improve and develop our assessments and services, as well as influencing thinking and policy on educational assessment nationally and internationally. Now, in order to save time, I will be giving brief biographies only of our speakers. Their full biographies can be found on the Cambridge Assessment website. And we're going to start by setting the context for textbooks. And to that end, we've invited Professor David Lambert from the Department of Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment at the Institute of Education at University College London to look at their history and help understand their importance. Having been at the Institute of Education in the 80s and 90s, David left to become the full-time Chief Executive of the Geographical Association, helping to guide its transformation into a significant provider of continuing professional development. In 2007, he combined this role with a return to the IOE as Professor of Geography Education. Professor Lambert.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and hello wherever you are. Some historical reflections from a geography educationist. But like all good history, I hope I can finish with something about the future too. My predecessor, or a predecessor at the Institute of Education, James Fairgrieve, was an ardent purveyor of regional geography and wrote a best-selling textbook in 1915 called Geography and World Power. In this, he sought to show how the history of the world, these are his words, has been controlled by geographical conditions. This reflected what became known as environmental determinism, that we are determined by our environment, which fueled an imperialistic and what we would now easily recognize as a racist view of the world. However, by 1919, he wrote a new edition where he said, and these are his words again, within the last generation or two, thanks largely to increased ease of communication, the world has become a single system with no part really independent of any other part. I think the date, 1919, is probably very significant. But why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because I think I can make two rather telling points which I think are relevant to today's discussion. The first is about what has been called an anti-textbook culture. I'm going to put on the screen, if I can, just a summary of the points I'm making in the next few minutes, and the first one is about an anti-textbook culture, which I think needs to be acknowledged and taken seriously. And the second point I want to make concerns the professional confusion that has resulted, because textbooks are used, because they are useful. And again, this needs to be acknowledged and taken seriously. So my first point, the anti-textbook culture. There's a sense in which the geography education community has never really recovered from a negative feeling towards textbooks, which I think can be tracked back at least to that imperialistic age which I've just characterised. This rose in my subject partly from the discredited paradigm of environmental determinism, through which geography seemed to purvey a single story of the world. It also resulted in what I might call regional geography light, which was perceived to be repetitive, tedious, laden with inert facts, which were all listed in the textbook. Norman Graves, another predecessor of mine at the Institute of Education, in the 1970s referred to this kind of geography as, and I quote, a burden on the memory rather than a light in the mind. And the trouble is, textbooks got the blame. This anti-textbook attitude has become firmly sedimented in geography, and by the later stages of the 20th century, basically throughout my teaching career. Much research to the present day criticises textbooks. It looks at images and text selections and is acutely conscious of bias and stereotypes and so on. Research papers have deconstructed geography textbooks, showing their inadequacies and their stereotypes. Now, nobody in my training, and nobody I have trained, nobody in my training ever said don't use textbooks. But to this day, magnified, I think, by the freedoms and affordances of a digitized world, there seems to be an assumption amongst teachers that teaching with textbooks is limiting. It becomes almost a badge of honor to some to say that textbooks are not used at all. And yet, this professional confusion. If I return to Fairgrieve again, and that amazing quote, I'll read it again. Within the last generation or two, thanks largely to increased ease of communication, the world has become a single system with no part really independent of any other part. That is a very modern take on globalization and what I would call thinking geographically about the world. So I would argue any teacher in Fairgrieve's time using his textbook would be engaged with an evolving discipline which puts subject contents into a coherent, intellectually robust structure. So it is interesting that as far back as 1985, John Lidstone wrote a PhD at the Institute about the use of textbooks in classrooms, in which he identified a sort of professional doublethink. Teachers, he found, definitely used textbooks to help structure their teaching, particularly the sequencing and organization of topics and themes within a superstructure of the subject's organizational principles, which was very important at the time John Lidstone was working because of the crumbling of the regional paradigm that I mentioned. If a paradigm crumbles, what replaces it? And school textbook helped teachers understand what replaced it from the 1960s on. But at the same time, teachers seemed impelled to deny the significance of textbooks, being so acutely aware of the perceived risks associated with teaching with textbooks as being limiting. So I would say perhaps there needs to be more research on the use of textbooks, for they can be used well and they can be used less well. For example, how do textbooks fit into what we might call the resource ecology of contemporary geography classrooms? What does the textbook offer and do really well that teachers might find difficult to do. And what I have in mind there is this whole process of trying to recontextualize a discipline into a school subject. You can't ask each individual teacher to do that on their own. And what can be added to the textbook to enhance the textbook and bring the geography learning experience alive? It is worth noting that the research evidence that I'm aware of, partly because I did some of it myself, shows that teachers are often constrained in the use of textbooks. So, for example, if pupils do not have a book each, it constrains what you can do and what you can set for homework. And the standard practice now, it seems to me, anecdotally, is that pupils do not necessarily have a book to call their own. If books are designed in a way that foregrounds activities and things to do, the book then ceases to be a place where you can send children to go for answers and explanations. There was a very interesting paper written by Rex Walford in the 1990s called The Strange Case of the Disappearing Text, where he found that textbooks seemed to have less explanatory power than they did in former times. Maybe the designers took over. So the effective use of textbooks presupposes that textbooks are themselves good. And I'm afraid it's not difficult to find examples of geography textbooks which seem to have no other rationale than to cover the syllabus specification. And from what I've said already today, I would argue that that's not enough. Such textbooks, in my view, are often poor because they, firstly, lack any subject disciplinary rationale other than preparing for the test, by which I mean there is no indication of the subject's purpose or overarching sense of narrative. The contents are just given, and you have to just receive them. And so textbooks are often poor when there's a lack of a coherent, visibly coherent pedagogy, by which I mean a way to approach and then engage with the subject matters. Literally, I think the book is trying to show what it means to think geographically about the world. And some books, I think, are poor because they even seem to lack curiosity or even explanatory power, sometimes even propagating out-of-date or even rehashed material. I need to stop, and I haven't really said what I would imagine is the future of an excellent textbook. But what I can say in one sentence is, I do see a future where a knowledge-based curriculum is critical. It's what I call a Future 3 curriculum, where contents are not just given to be digested, but to be engaged with. And I think a Future 3 curriculum would be impossible to contemplate without good textbooks.